Hello, I'm Shahram. I'm a PhD student at York University. Today we are going to be talking about a different kind of synthetic analysis using constituency grammar. First, why are we using constituency grammars? Central question in linguistics is how do we know when a sentence is grammatical? And historically, one of the first ways that people reasoned about this question was using a hierarchical universal structure called parse trees. Today, we are going to be talking about this formalization, how we can learn this from data and then apply it to sentences. And this formalization is called context-free grammar. A context-free grammar is defined as a set of four elements. These elements are first a set of non-terminal symbols that correspond to latent synthetic structures such as noun phrases or verb phrases that we don't actually see in a written sentence, but we believe to be there. And these are often multi-words and tactic abstractions. The second element are set of terminal symbols. These are the things that we actually do see. So these are the words that we observe. So dog plays any word that you observe in a sentence. These are the terminal symbols. And then we also have a set of productions that relate the non-terminals and the terminals. And so a production is defined as something as a left-hand side and a right-hand side. So the left-hand side always has a non-terminal, and the right-hand side has any collection of terminals and a non-terminal. So you can go from non-terminal to non-terminal, or you can go from a non-terminal to terminal, but you cannot go from terminal to non-terminal. And then finally, we have the stat symbol annotation, annotations, one of the special non-terminal symbols as the things that defines what makes a grammatical sentence. And we will see why it is important in a second. And this context-free grammar formalization is pretty flexible. So you can have unary rules that attach some sort of synthetic structure to individual terminals. And this could be something like part of speech tags. We can also make terminals and non-terminals on the right-hand side so that you can have exegialized expressions or sort of fill in the blank style rules and your productions if you want to. And you can also have empty terminals. So if you have optional components in a synthetic rule, you can express that using an empty terminal expression. The next thing that we will talk about today is a derivation. A derivation is a sequence of steps that take you from your start symbol to a final sentence. At each derivational step, you replace one of the non-terminals in your current structure with some rule. So you take the left-hand side of a rule, you replace that left-hand side with the things on the right-hand side of the rule. So let's see an example of this. We have some grammar defined by a bunch of productions, and then we have our derivations, and the first derivation S1 is just the start symbol. And we replace a start symbol with some rule from our grammar. Now we can replace the NP in this derivation, and we can then replace the det, and then the noun, and then we can start replacing the verb phrase within a single verb. And then a terminal, and so now we have in our derivation only terminals, and so this means our derivation is complete. We cannot go any further. And so this is how you go from an empty parse tree to a complete sentence. So now let's talk about some terminology. One important concept that we will need is that a yield. And so the yield of a parse tree is simply the terminals produced by that parse tree. And the yield is all that we observe. What we actually want to do in practice, however, is given in grammar, and it yield we want to determine the set of possible parse trees that could have produced that sequence of terminals, and we will call these the set TG of S. How do we go from this collection of terminals to the set of to set TG? And often this set has more than one element. So if the TG that has no elements and the sentence is not grammatical, if it has a non-zero number of elements, the sentence is grammatically. There is some derivation in the grammar that produces that yield. What's interesting is the case where you have more than one possible parse trees that could have produced your yield. So if you take the sentence, the man saw the dog with the telescope under some grammar, there could be two different parses that produce that sentence. And so this encodes the ambiguity of what is the phrase with the telescope modifying it. So in this case, we see that with the telescope is part of the prepositional phrase PP, and it has some internal structure, and the ambiguity comes in as to whether that phrase is part of a noun phrase or verb phrase. Both are permissible verb phrase. Can have a prepositional phrase as can announce a phrase. The grammar allows both. If it is a part of the noun phrase that includes the dog is taking a bath, it's it's talking about a dog with the telescope, so maybe a dog has a telescope strapped to his back. On the other hand, if with the telescope is part of the verb phrase, then this means that it is modifying the word saw. So the manner in which the dog is seen is with the telescope, and this is a more likely interpretation. But how do we formalize that preference? If the grammar allows both of them, how do we know which to prefer? And the way to do that, as you can probably guess, is that we want to attach probabilities to these two derivations. And we'll do this by adding a notation of probability to our context-free grammar. And that's what we will be talking about for the rest of today. So what we want to do is instead of just having a set TG given at particular yield, we want to have a distribution over the possible parse trees. So this leads to a couple of questions. One, how do we parameterize our grammar to give us this distribution, and how do we learn this parameterization from data? And finally, how do we figure out the possible parse trees given a particular yield of a sentence? To parameterize a probabilistic context-free grammar, what we are going to do is assume that for every production, we have some function Q that tells us the conditional likelihood of having that derivation. So we are going to condition on the left-hand side, and then we are going to ask what is the probability that left-hand side turns into the right-hand side. So that's the probability of a particular rule. And then for an entire tree that has a bunch of productions, the probability of the whole tree is just the product of all of the productions that went into that tree. Now, of course, this doesn't sum to 1, so we need to normalize this, but that's a relatively straightforward process. So, how do you estimate a probabilistic context-free grammar from data? Typically, the answer is to get a bunch of sentence and person, and most famously, this was done by Mitch Marcus, who parsed 1,000,000 sentences from the Wall Street Journal, and these require fairly sophisticated annotators. So, for example, linguistics grad students. But once you have a bunch of parse trees, it becomes fairly easy to compute the conditional probability of a rule. So if you want the conditional probability of a non-phrase turning into the minor adjective noun, then all you do is take the Emily estimate of the number of times you saw the derivation in P goes to the depth adjective in. And then divide that by the total number of times you ever saw NP as the head of a rule. But you will notice that we are taking the MLE estimate. Why don't we do smoothing here? One reason that you might not want to do a smoothing is that not doing smoothing rules out a lot of possible trees, and so you get fewer options of grammatical sentence. And as long as your grammar isn't too fine, you will still get all of the grammatical sentence. It is not to say people never do smoothing, but it isn't as important here. So as long as you don't have to find a grammar. Algorithmically, we are going to do smoothing very similar to what we did for the dependency parsers, and eventually we will get to the notation of probabilities. But first we will just consider the question of whether a sentence is grammatically or not. And to do this, we will build up the chart with all of the possible derivations of given spans, and then we'll just check to see whether there is a derivation that covers the entire sentence, and that will tell us whether the sentence is grammatical or not. What we are talking actually, we are taking a look at is something called the CYK algorithm. This is named for a cook younger Kisami, sorry. And what this does is it assumes that you are given as input at binary grammar and no recursive rule. That is, you don't have the same non-terminal on both the left-hand side and the right-hand side of a rule. You have an input of a grammar, and you have a yield, and you begin by initializing an array of booleans, and you say all of them to false. That is to say that or priority no possible span is a grammatical, and this array has 3 parameters. You have the start of the span, you have the end of the span, and then you have a non-terminals. This is saying for the span starting the S, ending the E, is there a non-terminal in that explains the yield in this span. And now what we are going to do is we are going to first look at singleton derivation. So we take a look at it, each individual word in our yield, and we see is there a production that explains that word. So this is equivalent to looking for individual rules that explains single words. Now we need to consider a spans of increasing length L. These spans started position S and have length L. They also have an associated pivot position K, and this pivot position tells us whether this larger span is broken up into two subspans. So what we are trying to do is we are checking for every rule in our grammar that takes a left-hand side alpha and produces a right-hand side beta and gamma, where we switch from beta to gamma. This is called the pivot position. So what we do is we first check whether the non-terminal alpha is already associated with this larger span. If it is, our job is done. Otherwise, we then need to see if we can break up this larger span into two sub spans. This is the dynamic programming step. So we check to see if we have already figured out that there is a span associated with a beta and gamma that goes from in the case of beta from position S to S plus K minus 1, and for gamma from S plus K to S plus L, and if both of those are grammatical spans associated with the non-terminals beta and gamma, then we say that we can have these larger spans associated with alpha. So let's see an example of this. So we have a yield book the flight through Houston. And here are some indices for the spans that we will be using to. So first we look at individual words and we build up all the non-terminals that can be associated with those words. So most of these are unambiguous. There is only one non-terminal that can be associated with each of those words. Book, however, is more interesting. So it has two possible rules that can be associated with this word. So we need to order our rules in a way such that we can look over these in order such that we can be sure that we won't miss anything. And this could go arbitrarily deep, and this is true for all of the positions and not just for book. Now we need to start looking at the longer spans and put together shorter spans into these longer spans. So first we look at the spans of link 2. And we can get at the minor phrase and a prepositional phrase. And so now we have gone through all the spans of length 2 and all the rules that could have put together spans of length 1 into spans of length 2. And now we look at the larger spans. And so now we have a span from of the length 3 that puts together flight and the noun and through Houston the prepositional phrase. So to do this, this required us to have a pivot at position 3. The noun went from 2 to 3 and the prepositional phrase went to 3 to 5. So there was the pivot that was the dividing line between those two spans. And in considering the spans, we also needed to consider other pivots. So, for example, you might have had some combination of flight through as one subspan and Houston as its own singleton subspan. But there was nothing that was grammatical that fit those constraints, so it was not included, but we considered it. There is also a subspan of a lens tree that combines a verb phrase and a determiner phrase into a sentence. At the very end, we are considering a subspan. That's the entire length of the sentence, and there is only one derivation that explains the entire yield as a sentence. And this book, the flight through Houston, which considers a book as a verb. And so we have now determined that we should not consider book as a noun in this context. By this point, it should be fairly clear that the complexity of this algorithm is proportional to both the size of the grammar, that is the number of possible productions, and there are and it is also cubic in the length of the sentence. So in a cube, the times the size of the grammar. Here is the complexity of this algorithm. A chart has into cell. Each cell has an options times the number of productions, and this is the total, the overall complexity of the algorithm. But we want more than whether a sentence is simply grammatical or not. We want to be able to decide which ambiguous parses we should prefer over others. And so this requires a simple tweak of the algorithm. Instead of just sorting a Boolean variable, we now keep track of the maximum probability of a subspan. We also have to initialize the chart so that these initialized spans have a 0 probability. And now we parse the sentence as before, and we take a look at the entire associated with the start symbol at the top of the chart. And that gives us the parse tree with the highest overall probability given the yield. And like before, we need to have back pointers so that we can recover the actual parts of the sentence. Recap for today: we talked about a hierarchical syntax model called the context-free grammar. We extended that with a probabilistic interpretation so that you could learn to solve the problems of ambiguity. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any question, please feel free to drop me an email.